I'm your host, Brenda Warren, the Soulutionist, and today my guest is none other than Pastor Jeffery F. Moffett. He is a pastor, as I stated, a real estate investor, a relationship coach, and an Army veteran. Jeffery Moffett, welcome to the show. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing wonderful. Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to talk to you today because I had questions based on having been introduced to you via Clubhouse. You were hosting a room that I was in, and it was very inspirational. And I wanted to talk to you about what it is you do, how you support the community, as well as how you support veterans. Because here on the Talk to Me show, we talk to people that are living their best lives and that also support veterans. And you, sir, are the total package. So, welcome to the show. And if you'd like to do me a favor and tell the audience a little bit about yourself, sir, before we start our conversation.
All right. As you said, again, thank you so very much, Brenda. As you've already stated, I am a pastor, an author, a relationship coach, a real estate investor. I'm a husband, I'm a father, and I am a disabled American veteran from the Army. I served 20 years active duty in the Army, and I served about another 20 years as an independent contractor. So total of about 40 years of my life
Mhm.
has been spent in and around the military community. I'm also a commander for a local DAV chapter in South Carolina, chapter number 44. And so that's a part, when your question is, how do I serve the community and the veterans? And so as a commander of a DAV, we serve, our motto is veterans helping veterans. And so we help them, our service officers help them with their claims. We help them in times of need or disaster. We also help to direct them to the correct resources for whatever their circumstance may be at the time, if it's something that we can't do as an organization. And then we also, I think the most important thing that we do is that we lend support. And so our monthly meetings are a safe place. And you may ask, how do we do that during COVID? And so what we do is I started doing phone conferences because we do have several seniors who aren't familiar with or able to do a Zoom conference or a video conference. And so we do a phone conference because almost all of them have phones. So we do a once a month phone conference to keep up, to hear each other's voice and support one another, and also to go over the business of the chapter. In the community, as a pastor, I serve the community as we look at humanity. We look at here where I'm at in Augusta, we're going through gentrification. And so to keep the community informed on what's happening as it relates to the rebuilding and the tearing down and the development, as well as to provide spiritual support. Then as an author, my book was written in Afghanistan. It's called Conversations with God from the War in Afghanistan. It was not intended to be a book. I actually have 5 books that I'm writing now. I haven't got published, finished yet. But as God would have it, that particular book was, it resulted from a 30-day challenge. And through that 30-day challenge, I journaled my experience. So it was a 30-day challenge of prayer. And from that, I ended up writing the book and creating a 31-day journal to go along with it for the readers to be able to do the same thing that I did. And it was written in such a way that rather than having a 365-day journal, you can take the 31 days and just repurpose it every month, and your prayer and your focus would be completely different. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I was familiar with the 31-day journal, but I had not got as far to realize that there was a book that accompanied that. So I'm going to go back because apparently my research has been lacking, and I don't like when I miss something. But I would go back and check that out because I like to support my fellow authors when they do have books by making sure that I get them purchased and read them. And I am a journal fanatic, so that's why I was familiar with the 31-day journal that you've done, but I didn't realize there was a companion book. So I will go back and check that out. Now, the room that I was in with you was discussing PTSD, but I do know that as a pastor, you can hit so many different areas, and as a veteran, there are things that you can do. So let's just take a little bit of time, since this is going to be a veteran focused show, and talk about a few different areas, and we'll start. Let's start with why you wanted to do the clubhouse room about PTSD.
One of the things that I've learned, I'm going to give a little backstory. So in growing up, my dad was old fashioned. He migrated from Tennessee in the 50s with my mother and myself. I was 10 months old. They weren't married at that point, but he did eventually become married. And so I believe out of being in a new place, part of his strategy was to protect us. And so that protection included exclusion, which means we didn't get to play with the other children that played in the block. And so there was 5 of us, and basically his philosophy was there was enough of us to play with each other. If we couldn't, then go to bed. So then we grew up under the philosophy children are to be seen and not heard. And so that shut down my voice. So coming into the military, I came in pre-programmed, pre-wired, that my story wasn't to be heard unless it was asked for. And going through my trauma, not only that I went through as a child, but then being molested when I first came into the military. At some point, I don't remember when the light bulb went off, but I realized that the more I talked about what I went through, the better I felt about it. And the more I released and moved from the space of being a victim to being a victor. From a religious perspective, I realized that talking about it took me from asking the question why to seeing the Romans 8:28, which basically says that all things work for the good of God, for those who are called to his purpose. And so being able to ask God first the why, and then receiving an answer to why, it changed my mindset. And so I started the room on Clubhouse because I believe if talking about it could help me, that it could also help others, and not in the professional setting. I go to counseling. I haven't been in a while since the COVID-19, but prior to that, I did go to counseling on a regular basis. But that's a different space than having a space that's open and free, and you can just let it out. And so that's why I started the club on Clubhouse for Strong Love Talks About PTSD.
Well, let's just stop right here. For those viewers that are not familiar, Clubhouse is an all audio format platform that allows people to connect in. We create spaces known as rooms and individual little clubhouses where you can go in and have a room about just about anything. One day you can talk about sewing. It depends on what people are talking about. You just join in a room and have a conversation. And for the most part, the spaces are safe. And Pastor Moffett here did create a very safe space because it's not often that men will talk about when they are sexually molested, but men felt free to have that conversation, even with women in the room. And I think the fact that we didn't have video allowed people to feel safer, which is one of the reasons why I really enjoy Clubhouse, because you just have the audio and people can feel freer and feel a sense of safety that they may not feel when it's one-on-one or when they're viewing someone and have to look at them in the face. But I was very moved by the way you ran the room and how people opened up to share their stories with a room full of strangers.
Yeah, there's a strange phenomenon, and that's what I learned and what I wanted to share is that I believe one of the greatest therapies that we have is to be able to share our story with someone who's non-threatening. And so when we learn how to open up to strangers, it's our minds processes that they're no threat. They don't know us. They don't know the story. They're not going to judge us. And if they'll listen, then we're able to flush out of us those those things that cause us to second guess ourselves, those things that cause us to feed into low self-esteem, those things that cause us to bottle up our anger to the point that we may implode. And so once I learned that, you just couldn't shut me up.
Mm-hmm. And there was the other thing too that I really liked about your room is how you discussed how communication goes. That it could be
Right.
if you were a visual learner
Right.
or if you were an auditory learner, and you explained that out so that people could understand that. Depending on if they could, how'd you say, if you close your eyes and you can see the green dot, then
Right.
you knew they were visual. But if they couldn't, then you knew they were auditory, and you had to change your language differently. That was really interesting to me. So how the room went from there and people were willing to share, I thought that was really interesting. Okay, so we talked about that. Also, there was a mixed room. There were males in there and there were females, and people felt free to share that. Are there plans for you to have other rooms to have veterans be able to share different subjects?
At
Or is
this,
PTSD the subject that you choose to focus on?
well, I chose the PTSD because, to be honest, that's a room to where I was focusing on a specific audience, and have, at being one who's in that challenge, I realized that that was a room that was necessary, and so I opened that room. I want to open a room for to teach what has allowed me to be successful in being a real estate investor. And so that room ultimately will be a room that I open up, be able to add value. But at that point, at some point we'll have a product that I will offer. The PTSD room is the product that I'm offering is a safe space and me. There's no monetary value for it. There's no book that I've created that I want to sell. It's just to have a room that gives a voice on this new phenomenal
Mhm.
real social media platform, and I'm really excited about it because, I think the term words mean a lot to me. So the term social media is misleading in the fact that social media has really been anything other than social. It's a place that uh, they're not really real connections. So you
Mhm.
could come on and be anybody. You could present yourself as a man, you could present yourself as a child, you could present yourself as a pastor, but you're not a pastor. Where on Clubhouse, if you're not on and it's not your voice, then you're not there. So it brings back a part of human connection.
Mhm.
You can hear a lot in a person's voice.
Yes,
You
you
can
can.
you can do more in when you see them along with the voice, but you can hear authenticity in a voice. You can hear, can if I can just use the term as a pastor, you can hear BS in a voice as well.
Mhm.
And so I'm excited to be on the ground floor in the beta uh, um, portion of this social media, which I think is going to skyrocket above anything that we already have. And so that's my purpose for the room for the PTSD again, is just to be able to give back and open up a safe place and to be able to provide value to my sisters and my brothers who have also served, but are also going through PTSD. I just want to say this because I say this in the room, and for those who may be listening here, we know that the APA uh, gave the designation of PTSD and describes it as being post-traumatic stress disorder. And I
Mhm.
don't like using that. When I think about that, I think what they did with ADD and ADHD. Uh, and so we know that all medical facilities, all medical practices are practice. So
Mhm.
they are not experts, and that's why they continue to practice. And so, since words are so powerful in our room, I like to use the definition for PTSD, or the acronym is, yes, it's post traumatic stress. That's what we actually deal with. That's the
Mhm.
real part about it. But our destiny, and the reason I use the word destiny is disorder says there's something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
By definition, we look it up. Disorder means it's not in order. There's something wrong. It's not what is accepted. Well, if we really think about what we experience, those who have had PTSD, regardless of whether it's MST or whatever the traumatic event is in our life that triggers it, is that our brain is doing what it was designed to do. It protects us at that time, and it puts it in a nice little box until it believes that we're able to deal with it. And then when it opens that box up, that's when we start to travel that road of destiny, of healing from whatever it is. And so I believe, and I will continue to use, for PTSD instead of disorder, I'm going to use the word post-traumatic stress, destiny. And I believe that we can help each other on that road, on that path of our destiny of healing and the purpose that God allowed us to go to experience that and go through it.
I had to do some reframing of the acronym myself because, as I told you in the room, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder back in 2011. And when I began to change my life about maybe 7 months ago now, I had to figure out a new way of looking at that. So I use the term, I plan to show up daily. That's
Okay.
how I get myself moving when, there's those times when I'm feeling the lowest of the low and I'm feeling like I can't go on. I just say, I plan to show up daily. And that's how I trigger myself to get into action. So I understand the reframing, but I really like the destiny part because that really speaks to me in a biblical sense to a path to healing.
Right.
So I understand that reframing of that. You know, Pastor, also as a veteran, you're a business owner and
Yes.
as a real estate. So let's talk about the real estate business part for you, because one of the things I think a lot of people don't understand is that when a veteran is diagnosed with PTSD, the public has this perception of us that we are no longer valuable, that
Right.
they could just throw us away. And then you have the VA telling us that we're no longer valuable. At least in my experience, it was basically go home, sit on the couch. And so I did for 8 years. I did nothing because I was under the mistaken belief that I no longer had value. But despite your diagnosis, you have been able to pastor and to have a successful real estate business. Can you talk about that some and your journey to that?
Yeah. So the journey began as a child, growing up poor in Detroit. We my both my parents lived in the projects, and so their life from childhood to adulthood was the projects in Tennessee. We lived on the impoverished side of Detroit, not quite on what many know as the east side, but we lived in the lower income sections of the west side until I was in the third grade. And the third grade, we moved from that area of the city, which of course the environment, the schools, and the resources that you have are proportionate to the income in those areas. And so my dad, and this is a whole different story that I won't get into, but because of some preferences that my dad had that we didn't know, or I didn't know about until after I was grown, he met someone that enabled us to move to a high middle class neighborhood.
Mm.
And being in that neighborhood, we lived maybe 3 blocks from Aretha Franklin, 5 blocks from Barry Gordy's parents. Um, we had doctors. Right 2 doors down from us was a music producer. And so we were in a neighborhood of affluent, successful people,
Mm-hmm.
but we were poor.
Mm.
And we were buying a house. I remember the house cost $19,900 is what that house cost. Um, because my parents got divorced, and we were still, I mean, we we're on welfare, and my mom signed me up for the military. I took the ASVAB test, not knowing not knowing what it was, and the recruiter took my mom out, gave her lunch, and she signed me up. I say that,
I
I
remember
got
when
I
you used to do
got
that.
sold away. I got sold away for a lunch, and mom didn't even bring some home for the rest of the kids. But at any rate, so I don't take up too much time. Um, we ended up losing that house. That house, as my sisters told me, I think it was maybe one or two payments that were left on the house before it went into foreclosure. And as a young single man at that time, under 21, because I came in, signed up at 16, came on active duty at 17. I wanted to be in the business because I didn't like being poor, and I always wanted to have some money in my pocket. So, my dream of doing that was to be able to have a business, and I wanted to own a home. So, not knowing that the house was going into foreclosure, and not knowing that I could have saved it, it always, it was the back of my mind after I found out was, I could have saved that house. Long story short, I ended up, not buying my first property until 96, which was a year before I retired. And my mindset, Brenda, my mindset was from the environment that I grew up in and what was projected on people who were poor, because I understood what it was to be poor. Didn't know how poor I was till I came in the military, but I understood what it was to be poor. And so my mindset was that people who looked like you and I couldn't buy houses. Now, that the lie to that was I lived in a neighborhood where a lot of people who looked like me bought their houses and owned their houses, but I had been programmed because I was poor that it was too difficult. Banks didn't want to give you money, and because of that mindset, I didn't even try until I stepped out of that. Why I stepped out of it, I can't tell you, but in 96, I bought my first rental property, or my first piece of income property, which is now, I still have, it's now completely paid for. And I bought that under using my VA loan. And then I would buy properties as I made more rank and my income increased. Then I would buy houses traditionally with traditional mortgages. And so my ideology back then in 96 was that if I could buy a piece of property and have the tenant pay at least half of my mortgage, if I had two properties and I use that, I have two properties that were worth $100,000 at the end of the mortgage, I would have bought two houses for the price of one.
Right.
So I don't use that model anymore, but that was the model that I started out with. As you can imagine, that's a slow model. Unless you're making a lot of money. And of course, we know in the Army we didn't get paid.
Right.
They get paid a whole lot of money. So eventually, I started buying tax lien property and auction properties. And one of the things, again, mindset. I keep saying that because I want the listeners to realize how important the mindset is. So I got over the hurdle of being able to buy. So we bought our first home, my wife and I, and then I bought a property for investment. Then I added another property to it. Then, my thing with my wife was anywhere the military sends us, because we get a housing allowance and all of that good stuff, that, hey, that's free money. So let's use that to buy a house rather than to rent. And so we did that. Every place that she went, we bought. And somewhere in there, somebody told me about the tax lien properties, and they told me what I thought was a ridiculous story. They bought a house for maybe $10,000. Okay, again, the way I grew up, that's impossible. How are you going to buy a house for $10,000? Houses cost, inflation has come, and houses cost way more than that. I mean, the house we had was $19,000, was worth $80,000 or $90,000 at the time. And so I dismissed it. Mindset. I dismissed it. And then somehow, due to the grace of God, I actually went to my first tax auction. It's probably been about 10 years now. And I bought something at that auction. I was green. I had no idea what I was doing. I went, had some money. And I made some mistakes that God turned around for my good. As a matter of fact, one of the first houses that I bought, I looked at it on Google Maps, and it looked fine on Google Maps. And so I won the bid, I paid for it, and I hadn't even gone to the house yet.
Oh no.
When then I went to the house and I looked at it and discovered that uh, it had experienced a fire. All right. And so I'm like, oh wow. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. So I have this house who's it really just needs to be torn down or a lot of money put into it to rehab it, which it could have been. But not knowing that it was a commercial lot,
Mm.
right? And not knowing that eventually the city was going to condemn it and tear it down while I was serving or working overseas. So I came back and I've got this empty lot. And eventually I found out it was a commercial lot. I still have that property. That property now is worth almost $500,000. All right. And so what I
So
do
even though
now,
you didn't know, it actually worked out to your advantage.
that Romans 8, Romans
That
8,
is definitely
28,
God working it out for your
yeah,
good.
he worked it out for my good. And even now to be able to share that story and to share the importance of due diligence,
Hmm.
because while that worked out for me, it may not work out for everyone if they
Right.
don't do their due diligence. And so as I went along, I developed, more data and more information of how to do the auctions, what the due diligence is, how the auctions actually work. And so from that, I've bought from regular auctions, and we've built a 7-figure business. And the wonderful, blessed thing about it is that I have 2 mortgages left. Outside of that, I own all of the property as long as I pay taxes.
Well, praise God for that. Now, do you teach others how to do this now, or is that something you're working towards?
That's something that I'm working toward, is putting together a course to
Hmm.
be able to teach that. And eventually, I'd like to be able to do a program. You've heard of the Rich Dad Poor Dad and
Absolutely, Robert Kiyosaki. Hmm.
Robert Kiyosaki, and then Flip This House by Stan. Is it Stan Murrow?
I'm not sure about that one, but I know Robert
All right.
Kiyosaki.
So the Robert Kiyosaki Rich Dad Poor Dad. We've had both of those programs presented here in my local area.
Hmm.
The Flip This House Stan Murrow is more pricey
Hmm.
than, and they usually will come in. I'm just gonna tell the truth about it. They'll
Hmm.
usually pick a higher grade hotel,
Hmm.
uh, and their audience is a higher income bracket
Okay.
than the Rich Dad Poor Dad. But both of them, you're going to pay anywhere from 30,000 to in excess of 60,000 for their. Excuse me, my phone's where I won't
Hmm.
answer, but you're going to pay anywhere from 30,000 to 60,000 for their training course that
Hmm.
they try to get you into, not counting your travel and your lodging and your food. One
Hmm.
of the things that they don't guarantee out of that is that you will actually be able to complete a deal
Hmm.
after you spent that kind of money.
Right.
And so, what I want to develop is a program to where uh, it'll be in that same neighborhood, probably a medium
Hmm.
between the 30 and the 60,
Hmm.
or the 60 plus. But what we would do is we would guarantee that what you spend for the program, that you will get a house
Hmm.
within a specified amount of time outside of graduating, that you will get a property that's worth valued, resale value at what you paid or more. And so that's what we're working on now, to be able to do that. If a person be able to follow those guidelines, that we'll be able to, when you spend your money, you know that we're going to guarantee that you're going to get. You spend 60,000, you're going to get a house out of it. Not only the training, but you're going to get a house. Resale value would be $60,000. Now you may have to spend some money to fix it up, because a lot of houses that you buy at the auction will need some type of renovation in them. But the guarantee will be is that once you put whatever you have to put into it, that house will be valued at least what you spent for the course.
That sounds like a pretty good deal right there. I look forward to when you get that program in place to come back and let's talk about it on Talk to Me. So
All
now
right.
we've talked about you being the author, the real estate investor. Now let's talk about being a relationship coach. I understand you do pre and post marriage. I'm currently going through a divorce after 23 years of marriage. Fortunately for me, it is a conscious uncoupling, so there is no negativity in our separation, just an unfortunate event that happened. How do you help couples with that? Or are you focusing on veterans, or is it just couples that come to you that are part of your ministry?
No, at this point, I'm actually in the process of launching a online program. We use a very successful instrument for to look at the compatibility of couples.
Mhm.
And so this isn't just the pastor saying this is what
Okay.
the Bible says.
Hmm.
We use a scientific instrument, and I use it because I was introduced to it when my wife and I got together almost 32 years ago now.
Oh,
We
okay.
we've uh, we've we've been together almost 32 years. Next year will be 32 years that we've been together.
Mhm.
We've been married, um, what 29 of those.
Okay.
So I was introduced to this tool through the military,
Mhm.
and I was so impressed with it that I did what was necessary to become a coach or facilitator, whichever term people want to use for it. And it is very effective. And so we not only do premarital, we do marital tune-ups or marital maintenance, as well as post-marital, because it's so important and it's such a vital part of our lives, the relationships. And so even in a post marriage situation, there could be trauma
Mhm.
that's not diagnosed as trauma. And if there are children involved, then that trauma can get re-triggered every time the two people involved in a relationship see each other. Then that can get transferred to the children. And so you brought up something early that we brought out in our clubhouse session, which was about communication. And it's so vital in all aspects of our lives. I learned it through uh, one of a graduate course that I was taking in the 90s. And so being born in the 50s, from the 50s to the 90s, I struggled in school because they did not teach the modalities of learning, and because they did not teach it, their communication to me, teachers' communication to me mostly came from visual teachers,
Mhm.
and I'm not visual. I'm not a visual person as far as learning. So, like the exercise that we did Sunday, when teachers would say, "Close your eyes and picture this," blah 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 blah. Well, one, I'd go to sleep
Mhm.
because I didn't know back then.
Mhm.
I go to sleep, and then two, if I didn't go to sleep, I would be bored because I couldn't see it. I couldn't see anything that they were saying, and they didn't understand why I couldn't see it. So I'm going to say that because anyone who's listening to this, our perception becomes our reality, and
Mhm.
9 times out of 10, a person perceives that other people learn the same way that they learn, and so it's natural for them. If they haven't been educated to the knowledge that everybody doesn't learn, everybody can't see a green tree with a red apple with a green dot on it when
Mhm.
you speak it to them. And so for that person, you have to, if you want to have what we learn in the military is effective communication,
Mhm.
then when you send a message, the person who receives it has to be able to give you feedback that identifies that they received exactly what it was that you sent. And
Mhm.
so if they don't, then the exchange has to continue until that happens. Otherwise, you have ineffective communication. And so in marriages, especially when one spouse has a different modality of learning, such as one is auditory and one is visual, or one is visual and one is kinesthetic or touchy feely hands on.
Mhm.
When it comes time for conflict resolution, which is supposed to be a growing part of a relationship, it actually becomes a deterrent to growth. It becomes something that separates. It becomes something that tears the marriage apart further than it is, because both parties become frustrated because they don't feel like they're being heard.
That makes sense.
And it's not that they're not being heard. It's that each one is trying to communicate in the best way that they know how with the tools that they have, but it's not effective to the other person. You know, it was I think Gary Chapman who wrote the book, The 5 Love Languages, and the psychology behind that is similar to the psychology behind the modalities of learning. So if you have 2 different primary love languages, it's not that the person doesn't love you, it's that the person is showing love the best way that they know how.
Yeah.
And so that becomes so vitally important. And as a pastor, I learned how to incorporate that in my teachings, into my sermons. I learned how to incorporate it into my counseling. So we would do sessions on how to overcome the challenge when you have a couple who has different modalities, primary modalities of learning. Because we all have, there's a total of 5, and we utilize all 5. But the primary and secondary are normally what drives our life and drives our ability to effectively communicate with others.
Yeah, I really like the 5 love languages. We studied those, and that was part of one of the things that helped us realize we needed to go. But that's another story for another show. Okay,
Right.
So you also mentioned that you are a commander at the DAV.
Right.
So once someone comes to you and you've helped them get their benefits, now they come back and they say, okay, Commander, I now have my 100%. What does that mean? Can I get a job? Do you guys support them in finding out that information and how they cipher through what they're able to do and what they can't do legally?
Absolutely. One of the things I'll do, first of all, is so if we were to talk on the business side, the first thing I'm gonna do is give a disclaimer. I am not a lawyer, so I don't give legal advice. So say if a person was asking me, should they have a LLC, should they have a S corp, should they have a corporation, I'm gonna tell them, first of all, I'm not a lawyer, and so I can't give you legal advice. I can share with you what I have learned are some of the benefits to having a certain designation. I can share with you that you may not have to go through a lawyer or through LegalZoom or Legal Shield, that you can go directly to your Secretary of State for whatever state you're in and file for your entity. And so as a commander, the first thing I'm going to tell a person that has received their determination from the VA of whatever percentage that they're getting, whether it be 100 or less, is that as a commander, I am not a service officer. I have service officers that are in the chapter. And so what I would tell them is that I'm going to tell you some of the things that I know that the service officer is going to ask you, so that you can be prepared when you go to the service officer, so that you can get the best benefit of your time. And so if you have 100%, the first thing is going to be, as you mentioned, are you employable? Are you not employable? Because that determines what you can do as far as receiving income and what you cannot do as far as receiving income. For a person who is 100% disabled, unemployable, which then affords them the criteria that they need to apply for Social Security. And at that point, they can't have any other income. They can't own a business outside. They can't have income outside of, for the most part, of their disabilities and those things. Now there are some exceptions. I want to make sure, and this is why I say I'm not a lawyer. So they would have to talk to a lawyer to find out what those exceptions to the rules are, and hear that from a lawyer so they would know. But for the most part, in general, I had to take my wife's name off of my business as the CEO. And so now she's a secretary, but she can't hold a position that she could get paid for, because that would jeopardize what she receives in her Social Security. And so what we would do is, again, based off of my knowledge, I would maybe tell them, again, what I know they're going to be presented with by the service officer, and then I would recommend them to a service officer.
But now, if you're 100% disabled, but you're not listed as unemployable, you can own a business?
Yes, I'm 100% disabled, but I'm employed. Right now, again, I'm not a
But
lawyer.
there's still exceptions, and I guess what it is we've been talking to a lot of veterans. I've been trying to go to the VA website. They don't make it easy for you to find out exactly what you can do, and I was hoping that possibly as a DAV you would know this, but I will continue to do some research, and I'm gonna come back to you guys that are viewing and give a complete detail on what is possible and what is not. Because one of the things that happened for me was that once I received the designation, I was given the impression that I wasn't allowed to do anything. And the person that I talked to, and it wasn't until years later that I discovered that you could have this and still work. I was not listed as unemployable, but I came off my job thinking that I was no longer able to work. But at that time, really, even though I wasn't listed, as my mental state and my capacity at the time was so diminished, I needed to come off my job. But now that I'm starting to feel better, I'm in counseling and receiving the proper medications, I'm asking myself the question, could I do something more? What are the possibilities, and what can I legally do without jeopardizing benefits? And what other assistance is available? One of the things I do, Pastor, is you'll see the site above my head is www.nevcc.org. That's the New England Veterans Chamber of Commerce. They are a wealth of information for veterans, and I encourage you to go to that website if you're looking for support for yourself or other veterans. They have a whole section just related to business.
Right.
And if you know of veterans that are in need of post 9/11, that are in need of getting rid of educational debt, for example, they have all the information there that you need to connect with the right branch to get your student loans wiped out. I had a friend that had $106,000 for a student loan with one application taken care of. That to me is amazing.
Absolutely.
On the list, there's also things called Rosie's List, which is basically the Angie's List for the military. So if you were looking for contractors, contract services, you go there and you can find services that have been vetted. So you know that they are who they say they are. So that's really a good site to have under your belt.
Yeah, we'll definitely share that site with our chapter, and I'll share that with other veterans that I know. But you said something very important when we talk about what you can do if you have 100%, but it's not unemployable.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, not as a lawyer, but one of the things, there are some things that the law may say that you can do as a veteran that fit under the guidelines and the regulations and the stipulations. However, think about this. If you have a business that requires you to do something that your VA determination said that you cannot do,
Absolutely.
then you jeopardize your determination.
Right.
And so, the law is not going to tell you that. That's something that someone like you or I are going to have to bring up. But it's also something that the veteran has a responsibility to look at what the determinations are, what the limitations of the determination is, and then to make sure that they're not violating those limitations, or they could have that determination reduced or completely reversed.
And that's a good point you bring out there, because for me, I was a director in a hospital, had 120 employees and 5 managers, and I could no longer do that job in my current situation. The stress alone and the requirement to walk, the lifting, all the stuff that was required of the job does not, based on my physical limitations, my mental limitations, that just would not work. However, doing interviews like this,
right,
sitting in my own home, that's not a problem for me. And I have spoken to my doctors, and they encouraged me to do this. This does not violate my limitations. So this
Absolutely.
is something I could fully do functionally, and I don't do it that often that it would become a pressure. But like for me, this past month, I took the entire month off because I became overwhelmed and I
Right.
noticed that I was starting to be triggered. So I took a step back and said, okay, I don't have to do this. I don't have to do this right now. And you have to know your own limitations and be
Absolutely.
realistic so you don't create a train wreck for yourself.
I think that's the frequency. It's kind of in the air, the energy that's going around with the COVID 19 and the shelter in place and so much grief and so much pain that's just running through the entire world right now. I actually took the last month off as well, and that's one of the benefits of being a business owner is that I can work when I want to work. I don't have to work when I
Mhm.
don't have to work. I have some physical limitations, so I can hire people to make up in those areas of lifting and the physical limitations that I incurred being in the military. If I'm having a super challenging day of PTSD, and on that, one of the things I want to eventually get into is talking about when, as I said, my wife is a 28-year veteran
Mhm.
who has her own challenges. So we live in a household with two people who have been diagnosed with PTSD and trauma. And that brings about its own
Oh,
challenge.
yes.
Okay.
And
So
we don't hear a lot about that. So maybe one day we can have your wife on and we can talk about the challenges of being a military couple, both being diagnosed with PTSD. So maybe after this, you could talk to her and see if that's something she'd be interested in coming on talking about the challenges of a couple that
that would be, I
are
would talk to
working
her about it.
through.
I'll talk to her about it. But knowing our relationship, it would be a it would be more beneficial to your listeners and your audience if we did it separate,
Okay. And
because
that's valid.
we don't want to have the PTSD covered.
No, we do not. We absolutely do not. We want to keep everything calm
Oh,
and peaceful. But before we wrap this up, I would love to talk about your perspective of all this as a pastor, because I think it's important for the people listening to, you're an author, you're an investor, a business owner, a veteran, and then you add in man of God. You know, faith, based on what I heard in that room, plays a significant role in your life. And the title pastor says that it does alone. So,
right.
how do you balance your diagnosis, your business, your veteran status, your wife's diagnosis, and all this, and those people that will say, but you're a pastor? How do you do that?
Brenda, that's a very, very good question. It's a process. I've not always been where I'm at today. As a matter of fact, this time last year, I was at a different place. Um, Having been brought up in the church,
Mm-hmm.
having traveled the world in the military, having actually pastored services all around the world, uh, and at one point discounting what God had done. I mean, literally, there was a point in my pastorage that I was like, God, I want to be able to affect people all over the world. From
Mm-hmm.
watching your televangelists. You see what
Mm-hmm.
they do, uh, and then you know what your heart is. And it was like,
Mm-hmm.
God, I want to do this. I want to do this for you. I want to do this for you. And then, like God did with Job, he just had this conversation with me.
Mm-hmm.
And in that conversation, he pointed out what I had discounted. I didn't even recognize that I had been all around the world and pastored all around the world. I've already done what I asked him to do, but
Mm-hmm.
I had discounted it because it was just what I did. I had already been a mentor or disciple hundreds of people
Mm-hmm.
in the church from all different nationalities, from all different walks of life, and again around the world. I hadn't processed that,
Mm-hmm.
and so all of that experience, what I've come to where I'm at now is recognizing that, first of all, we are taught or cultured or programmed with the wrong definition of pastor.
Mm-hmm.
And so pastors get put immediately on a pedestal
Mm-hmm.
unless they've done something that knocks that pedestal out from under them. And I'm going to say something that some may not agree with, but it's where I've come to. So when we look at the history of religion, uh, we have to go back to Africa. Uh, Almost every major religion that exists in the world today has its origin in Africa, to include Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
Christianity didn't begin as Christianity. Christianity began as Judaism. Judaism then was the genesis of what we now know as Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So what Jesus taught in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 was the first reformation of religion as far as Christianity. It was the reformation of Judaism. So he took Judaism from what it had been all the way from Genesis to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He took that and he revolutionized it. It's found again in Matthew 5, where you have the 6. He says, "You have heard it said, but I say." So you have heard it said was the old traditions. It was the old doctrine of Judaism. But he says, "But I say," which was the revolution. It was the new, the doctrine. It was the new teaching, and it was the new way of Judaism. Those who followed him were called followers of the way. It is he that said again that I am the way, the truth, and the life. So those who followed him were literally identifying with him and his identity, which was the way. Book of Acts tells us that they were first called Christians in Antioch. Antioch is in what we now know as Europe. All right. So they were first called Christians in Antioch, but being called a Christian in Antioch is like being called the N-word in the United States for us.
Wow.
So it was a term, a derogatory term. It was a demeaning term. It was a term of mocking. And so it wasn't a term that you wanted to be associated with, or you would have called yourself. So the people who followed him then would have still continued to call themselves followers of the way. It was in the 300s that Constantine, after having an epiphany, used the cross, which was more shaped like an X than what we have as a cross. He put that on the shields of his soldiers. They won the battle. And then he deemed that Christianity was the religion of the state. That was the hijacking of Christianity. And so what we're taught, and then this all goes into the term pastor or apostle or bishop. These terms have been defined by European theology. And because they're being defined by European theology, what the Romans actually did, from taking what Jesus did in teaching and creating disciples, and the word disciple in the Hebrew means to be what the teacher is or be what the rabbi is. It's more than just a student. It's literally gives the sense of if the rabbi or the teacher walked with a limp, you walked with a limp because the rabbi walked with a limp. And so it's a deeper connection, it's a deeper relationship. But through European theology, this word has come to mean something that Jesus never intended it to mean, because the clergy under European theology and under the Catholic Church, they controlled everything. They told you what you could do, what you couldn't do. As a matter of fact, we just finished a study in my series that I'm doing called Christianity, a Hijacked Religion. And the popes actually deemed and taught the congregation that the popes were infallible. So whatever the popes came up with, that's what the people had to follow. The people had more respect for the pope than they had for God, because they were taught that basically the pope was God. The pope was on alongside of God, and whatever the pope said, that's what they had to do. So what you ended up with was an educated pulpit and an ignorant pew. And that theology has been brought to America, so that I say that the majority of the congregations in the Protestant or Christian religion are ignorant. They're biblically illiterate. They have no idea of their history. They have no idea of why they even respect the pastor to the point that they respect the pastor. And so that term pastor, I've learned now, I'm just a servant. I'm the one that God has called to present to you information that you have to do what God gave every human being from the very first one he created, Adam, to whoever the last one is that he creates, is choice. All right. He gives every last one of us choice. And that's what makes Christianity a different than almost any other religion, is that no matter what, God gives us choice. And so I said that was a long way to get to the way I deal with the diagnosis, the way I deal with life now, the way I deal with congregants, the way I deal with anyone that wants me to teach or pour into them, is that at the end of the day, God calls every person to their own action. My job as a shepherd, all right, which, think about it, pastor, even though we hear this term, those who are visual will create a total different picture in their mind if you say shepherd than if you say pastor. Mm-hmm. The picture that they get of shepherd is really what Jesus called us to be, because he says, what? I am the good shepherd. Mm-hmm. All right. But the shepherd of what? The shepherd of sheep. All right. And the job then is not for the shepherd to control the sheep, but to guide the sheep. Mm-hmm. And so, in my job as one who guides, which means now that I can have a bad day just like anybody else can have a bad day. I could be diagnosed with PTSD like anybody else could be diagnosed with it. My wife and I could have some issues just like anybody else's relationship could have. My breath stinks when I wake up in the morning, just like everybody else's breath stinks. It's imagine it. If I let out some gas, it stinks, whether it's at mm-hmm. home or in the church. So I'm human, just like everybody else is human, and so I try to portray that to those who have been indoctrinated with, the pastor is up here and everybody else is here, and that I have the answers, and that my prayer is going to get through to God somehow quicker than your prayer. No, mm-hmm. if we indeed believe that the Holy Spirit is what Jesus promised, and he sent it back like he said he was going to, and if you, Brenda, have the same Holy Spirit that I have, the truth of the matter is that we have the same frequency, the power is the same, we have the same access. So if we have the same access, if we're connected to the same power, we're talking to the same source, then how does my prayer hold any priority over your prayer? It becomes a mindset, because the Bible says if we don't believe, we can't receive. So if the only difference is going to be is if I believe that my prayer is getting through, then I'm going to act on that belief. If you disbelieve that your prayer is getting through, you're going to act on that disbelief. But it does not change the fact that we both have the same access. We both have ability to have the same amount of power, and that God loves both of us the same. And so as a pastor, that's my job now, is to educate. How do we get away from the effects of European theology that was further hijacked and manipulated during slavery, but is propagated every Sunday in our churches? How do we undo that? How do we reprogram back to exactly what it was that Jesus taught in Matthew 5, 6 and 7? I hope I didn't go on a rant on that, but I get passionate about the church, about my position, what it actually means, how it's perceived. And oftentimes I've been told that, Rev, you're too transparent. We didn't need to know all of that. Well, maybe you don't think you needed to know all of that. However, I believe that there's a 50-50 was it 50% my responsibility and 50% the congregation's responsibility to, one, not put me on a pedestal, and two, to recognize the real position that God put me in. Because I believe, Brenda, there are those who truly started out with an intention to be able to help people.
Yes.
However, they didn't understand the dynamics of people. And so you can go in humble, but you get a congregation that puts you on a pedestal. Now you have all this expectation, that you're trying to live up to, which changes your mindset, because now you start to believe that you are who they projected you to be.
That makes sense. Well, I have one last question before we end this conversation
All
today.
right.
All right, Pastor Moffett, here's your question. For the remainder of 2021, how do you plan to tap in to living your best life?
Whew. For the remainder of 2021, the way I plan, and I'm actively involved in living my best life, is to complete more of the projects that God has given me, to utilize more of the stages that He presents. So, such as this interview, such as Clubhouse, such as uh, overcoming a part of my trauma that causes me to not complete projects, so that I'm not abandoned from them, to actually go back and start to complete those projects one at a time, and to continue to tell this story, continue my Bible studies, uh, where we're actually teaching the history and showing how that Christianity as we know it is indeed a hijacked religion. And I tell folks, don't get it twisted, don't get it messed up. I'm going to die a believer in Jesus Christ, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, just not in the way that we've been programmed to in the United States of America from a European theology. I'm going back to the original, which is from Africa, and to be able to teach that if we go back and identify our true identity, not only will it help us in our religious endeavors, but it helps us in our interpersonal and our intrapersonal, because I can identify with the world came out of Africa. You know, the world came out of Africa, which means it's people who look like you and I, that without us, regardless of what the world says about us, regardless of what the world feels about us, regardless to how much we've been trampled on, it is the tenacity that's in our DNA that has allowed us, regardless to what obstacle we have been faced with, whether it was slavery in the Bible days, which we hardly ever address, whether it was the slavery outside of religion that in the mass number of countries in Africa, which is more than the states that we have in America, if it was slavery in some form or fashion in that continent, to what we went through in the transatlantic slave trade, to the modern day lynching done by police, that there is something in our DNA that allows us to rise up from the bottom, even if we've been poured into concrete. God has put something in us that allows us to come to the top and take that concrete block and build a skyscraper. And so that's how I see myself continuing to pour in, and that's why now I'm working on 2 books. Then I'm doing a chapter at a time. Both of those are almost complete. I continue to do this Bible study regardless to what happens. I'm gonna say this one last thing, Brenda, for anybody that's listening in, and for you also. God brought me to a point. I'm in my early 60s, and in my 50s, I realized something that changed my life, and that is, until a person is willing to accept that they have nothing to lose, they will always be held back by their fear. Until you get to the point that you feel you have nothing to lose, you're going to allow some fear to hold you back. But once you come to the conclusion that you have nothing to lose, then where do you go from nothing? You can't go anywhere but up. And so even whether that be in a business, whether that be in a marriage, whether that be as a pastor, because let's admit it, Some pastors, that's the only income that they have. God has blessed my wife and I that we've never had to depend on the church. And so depending on the church to take care of my family hasn't been something that I had to deal with. However, staying pastor was something that, okay, I want to stay a pastor. So do I say this or do I not say that? Mm-hmm. But I'm to the point now, I have nothing to lose. If I lose my wife, I've got nothing to lose. If I lose the church, I have nothing to lose. The only thing I have left to lose is my life. And so if to lose my life and not have lived it to the max and to the purpose that God called me to, because I was afraid of what somebody was going to say, regardless of who that person is, I believe that Miles Monroe would say that's a tragedy. I lay in the grave, or I would lay in the grave with so many talents and so much ability buried. Mm-hmm. And so that's how I plan on doing it is to continue what I'm doing now, work on me where I know, that things that I deal with, to work on that starting 100 projects and not, finishing them, but to start to get them out and to come on programs like yours. And thank you so much for allowing me to be able to come and to pour in on your platform. And thank you so much for supporting us on Clubhouse. And I'll continue to do those platforms, whether we get anything monetary out of that, because what happened Sunday, you can't put a price on that.
No, you can't. That was pretty awesome.
Yeah, you can't put a price on that. And this was our third Sunday doing it. And so we will continue to do that room just for that purpose. And then I'll open other rooms that we will, the end goal of that will not only be to help people, but to also monetize that help. Because again, we know that if we look at the Bible, there's actually more scriptures about money in it than anything else. There's more scriptures about money and finances than there is about love. We just haven't been taught that. And so a lot of people shy away from it. And I'll say this last thing, just to prove that point. Many know that Jesus' earthly father, Joseph, was a carpenter, which means he had a trade. That means he was an entrepreneur. He was a businessman. And so the way that he helped his community and the way that he kept his family fed was by the trade that he had. Well, if you understand the culture, that means that Jesus would have been taught how to be a carpenter because that's what his dad was, which means now that he also became an entrepreneur. We know that his public ministry didn't start until the age of 30. So up until that age, he was a part of that business that his dad had. But look at this, Brenda. Many people don't see this. Many people don't recognize it. Even though his father was an entrepreneur, even though he would have been an entrepreneur along with his father, many people miss this important fact of the importance of money and resources. Mm-hmm. The Magi, some call them the three kings, but they're Magi. They came from different places in the world. They were guided by the stars. Some folks have issues with astrology, and I won't even get into all that, but they were guided by the stars to where this baby Jesus was at, the Messiah, the promised deliverer. What did they bring? They brought resources, myrrh, frankincense, and gold. Those were resources. Those were commodities that catapulted his family into an entirely different class of life. He was a baby. He couldn't spend any of that. But look at God's provision. God brought the resources that the family needed in order for the family to be able to support Jesus up until the age of 30. And so if God did that for his own son, why should we feel bad about doing things that bring in those type of resources? As we would say on Clubhouse, this is Jeff, and I'm done speaking.
Well, Jeff, I'm glad you had the opportunity to continue speaking. I'm glad we had the opportunity to do this today. And at this time, please tell us, how do people get in touch with you?
All right, you can get in touch with me. Our Facebook page for our church is Historic Hosanna, and that's spelled Hosannh, Missionary Baptist Church. That's our Facebook page. You can get in touch with me on my personal Facebook page, Jeff Moffett. And if you want to see another side of the Rev that I'm just starting, you can go to my Facebook page called Not the Rev. And there I'm actually doing adult Christian comedy. Okay. So I'd like you to check that out and tell me what you think. I only, excuse me, only have one video up now, but we'll be putting some more content up. I had cut my thumb and I didn't want to be, I'm cooking and telling comedy, so I didn't want to be cooking with. And then on Instagram, I'm jeff.moffett.50. And on Clubhouse, I'm Not the Rev, all together, NOTTHEREV.
Okay. Well, we know how to get in touch with you, and I thank you again for taking the time to talk to me today. I'd like to invite you and all the viewers out there to go to www.nevcc.org/projects. That's where you will find the opportunity to thank a veteran. There are 12 months in a calendar year, and each month has a different theme. This is February, y'all, so it is Live, Learn, and Pass It On. January was Fresh Start. There are all kind of other themes in the other months. Take the time to read through, find the theme you like, and leave a thank you for a veteran. If you like all of them, leave one in each month. The more the merrier, because at the end of the year, we are going to compile all those thank yous, and in 2022, some very lucky veterans are going to get a book that's going to show them all the appreciation passed along during the year. So take the time out to go to www.nevcc.org/projects and thank a veteran. They'll appreciate it. As always, I'd like to remind all my viewers, the choices you make today will be the reality you live tomorrow. Choose wisely. Thanks again, Jeff, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed this time.